Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us whenever you are watching this video, whether it's live with us tonight in Laurel, or if you are watching the recording on our YouTube channel later. Thank you so much for spending part of your time with us. My name is Ann Bennett. I am the Executive Director of the Laurel Historical Society here in Maryland, and I am joined tonight with our main presenter, our museum administrator here in Laurel, Luis Vacasoto, and we are going to be exploring the world wars in Laurel. So this is going to be a mix of revisiting the two previous exhibits that the museum has put on featuring World War I and World War II. But we're also going to let you in on a little behind the scenes in terms of how we continue to do research on topics as new donations and new research materials are made available to us. So we're very excited to share with you some updates to the exhibits that have been put on in the past. And if you didn't see the exhibits at the museum in years prior, you are in for a treat because we're going to go through a general history of the wars, Laurel's involvement with it, and then take a look at some of these new collection items. So I will come back and talk about some of those new items in a little bit. But again, I am going to pass it over with great excitement over to Luis to have him started off. Luis has done a lot of research as part of his presentation tonight, and he's just a wonderful researcher and a great asset to the museum. And so we're really excited to hear about the world wars in Laurel. So Luis, please take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm Luis. I'm a historian. I did both my bachelor's and master's in history. I'm tend more towards European history, German history to be specific. I did my bachelor's on the unification of Germany in the 1870s and Bismarck. And I did my master's thesis on actually has to do with World War II. It's actually the German communities in the US and Latin America during World War II and their internment. So I'll touch on it a little bit because we speak a little bit about it in regards to Fort Meade later on. But yeah, that's sort of my background. I also did some Maryland history, primarily African American history in Maryland. I interned at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History and Culture at in Baltimore, and then I did some other projects. So yeah, we can go to the next slide here. Yeah, so I'll be covering what Laurel was like in both World War I and World War II. This is a basic overview of what I'll be talking about in regards to World War I, with the addition of how women and African Americans were involved in the war at the end of the presentation, sort of lumping it all together. And my goal is to provide a basic structural sort of base of knowledge on the history of Laurel during this time period. And I've decided to cover these particular points. I found them the most important, and they lay a really good foundation for sort of the general experience of the time. And there will be a lot of text in the presentation. Don't worry, like Anne said earlier, you'll get a copy of it afterwards, and then you can always email me questions, which I will be more than happy to answer. So next slide, please. So pre-war Laurel, in the time period just before the war, Laurel had around 3,000 inhabitants. We got that information from the census. The majority of them were small family-run farms, farm owners, many of whom had lived here for several generations. And at the end of the World War section, Anne will show you a map, give you a sort of basic overview of what the area looked like at the time. Next slide, please. So Laurel, 1916. The beginning of the major military movements in Laurel was in 1916 when the U.S. government mobilized troops to help with the increasingly hostile situation at the Mexico-U.S. border. Civil war broke out between the Constitutional Army led by Venustiano Carranza and Pancho Villa in 1915, and the U.S. had aided the Carranza-led army in defeating Villa's forces. And in retaliation, Villa goaded the U.S. into invading Mexico by conducting a raid on a border town in New Mexico. So in June of 1916, the U.S. passed the National Defense Act, which gave the National Guard their name, and Maryland responded by assembling the National Guard in Laurel at what would be Camp Harrington. They would be sent to the border to help protect it. On June 20th, the Company F of the 1st Maryland Regiment arrived on Main Street in Laurel by trolley, and they marched down Main Street to cheers from the local citizenry who were surprised to see them arrive. On June 30th, all the troops that were in Laurel were loaded up on trains over to the Texas-Mexico border. The B&L Railroad actually provided Pullman cars for all the soldiers as they were unable to find regular overnight coaches for the enlisted men. I'll give you a moment to read it before we pass over. Okay, feel free to whatever. So here's a picture of soldiers at Camp Harrington. And this ran like along Talbot Avenue from what I've seen. Okay, next slide whenever. So Camp Meade, on April 16th, 1917, Woodrow Wilson, the president, declared war on Germany, and there was a need to build bases to train troops that were drafted for the war. In May, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the president to raise a national army of 500,000 men by conscription. The National Defense Act, which had given the National Guard their name, also had provisions for the creation of 32 new military installations or cantonments. So, lured by the prospect that it would bring $20 million per year of new business to the area, a Maryland delegation led by Representative J. Charles Linthicum of Baltimore lobbied the War Department to award Maryland one of the new installations. On June 14th, the same year, the War Department announced that it had approved the Annapolis Junction site as one of the sites for the installation. On July 2nd, construction of Camp Meade began, and on September 26th, the first group of Marylanders constituting a large part of the 79th Division arrived at Camp Meade. So next slide, whenever. So here's some photographs from our collection of Camp Meade. I believe these all arrived, or other than the one on the right. So the one on the left arrived after the initial exhibit. So that's new for everyone to see. As you can see, a lot of buildings, big sprawl of area. So next slide. And again, here's a panoramic view that we have in our collection of Camp Meade. So I want to go back and briefly talk about the involvement of the railroads in the creation of Camp Meade as it aligns with our upcoming exhibit in February of next year. In 1917, the B&O, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Electric Railway all owned railheads at the Annapolis Junction site that was chosen for Camp Meade. Investors from the B&O had seen the possibility for profit, and some of its ownership group were part of that initial delegation. So similarly, the WBA was struggling financially and had terrible ridership at the time, and they also saw this as a great opportunity for growth. Together, they agreed that the WBA would build the majority of the tracks leading to Camp Meade, while the B&O would build around 4 to 5 miles of track. The land for this project was leased from the small family-owned farms in the area, and eventually many would move away when the land was bought outright. The WBA would see a massive spike in ridership as a result, which helped save the company for a while. The railroad workers also aided in the war effort by signing up to have part of their salary to go to buying war bonds. Women were also hired to fill many positions that were left by men, mostly clerical and cleaning positions, but they eventually would be trained to work the drill presses and assist in blacksmith shops and much more. So the 4th Regiment goes to Laurel in 1917. On August 6th, nearly 400 4th Regiment, 400 men of the 4th Regiment arrived to Laurel on the B&O from Fort McHenry, where they would train at what was the old Camp Harrington site from 1916. And on September 16th, more than 4,000 guardsmen, including the 4th, departed from Laurel to northern ports where they would head to France. By late 1917, overcrowding in Camp Meade was becoming a real issue. And in December, the War Department was given possession of what's now Laurel Park for war purposes. The new Camp Laurel would house the 23rd, the 66th, and the 50th Regiments of Engineers, where they would be trained to construct bridges, roads, narrow gauge railroads at or immediately behind the front lines in France primarily. The citizens of Laurel often welcomed the soldiers into their homes, as many of them craved, the creature comforts that reminded them of home. Also, the military put on 2 dances each week on the second floor of 508 Main Street, as well as some dances being held at the Laurel Mill. So here's a picture of the Knights of Columbus building at Camp Meade. And then next slide, whenever. So soldiers came from all over the country, but I came across the story of the two men who had come from Germany. The original exhibit had them as German immigrants, but I looked at the translation and I believe they were Americans who were living abroad and they were drafted for the war, so they returned to the U.S. to serve in the army. Soldiers they primarily lived in tents at Camp Meade, but some were also housed at the Laurel Mill. The steam-driven machinery gave them a lot of warmth, and then every day they would march to Camp Laurel for training. Yeah. And if you want to take over here.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Louise. So I am going to kind of take it from map to map. We're going to transition a little bit from the history that Louise has filled you in on. And again, please, if you have any questions, put them into the Q&A or to the chat. We'll be happy to answer them as we go on. Or if you have any other research concerns or anything like that, feel free to email us later. But I wanted to kind of just ground everything in, the geography of the area. And if any of you were watching or seen on YouTube, the Archaeology of the Ninth Street tenant houses presentation that we give, you know that I love maps, and maps are really important for, again, kind of grounding us in the place that we're talking about. So what you're looking at right now is USGS. It's the United States Geological Survey from 1926. They do this, every couple of years, going all the way into the 1800s, and they still do it today. It's a valuable tool for archaeologists, for anyone studying the topography of the landscape, but also it's a great tool for historians and archivists and museum professionals as well, because it gives a nice overview of the built environment as well. So what you can see kind of in the upper left is you can kind of see Laurel, the downtown Laurel that we know, where it says boundary line. That's kind of what we're looking at is the Patuxent River. To the north of that boundary line is Howard County, and to the south is Prince George's County. And that's right is where the Laurel Museum is located, all the way at the far end or the left of Main Street there. So all these little black dots represent houses or buildings or a structure of some sort. It doesn't go into great detail, but we can see that there's actually a lot of railroads built up. So what Louise was talking about in terms of the B&O, the WB&A, all of these, had stakes in the area. And so you can see some of these stations in and around the Laurel area, like Mistletoe Springs and Oakcrest. Those were also important stations going down south to Washington, D.C. And then as we kind of orient to the very right side of your screen, you can see where it says, Fort Meade National, I think National Guard. I forget what's the rest of it there, but you can see that it's like the military reserve on the far right. And so you can see that in between that large mass of black on the left and some built up on the right, including the WE&A, there's not much in between. And so that's vitally important going back to what life was like in Laurel at this time. It was still very rural. A lot of the people, the residents in this area, lived on the small family farms, like Louise mentioned. Some were living in Laurel, commuting to DC or Baltimore on the railroads, or still kind of the trolley at this point until it ended in 1925. So we can see that there's, not many roads directly going, from Laurel to the base. And then the railroads, as we can kind of see, are kind of split going off to the left to Laurel and point south, or to the base directly on the right-hand side. So I kind of wanted just to give you this visual representation. And then there we go. So, what I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about is a brand new donation that was given to us to research by Professor Maxime. And what he was able to share with us was a small scrapbook of photographs and one point or portion of a handwritten, I guess, letter that captioned all of the pictures. And so there's, I think, about 25 or so total from a scrapbook of an unknown soldier that came through Laurel on his way over to, the European front, the Western Front during World War I. So I am delighted to share these with you, that you are seeing these for the very first time in public. We are still currently going through and researching them further. And I do have to warn you, some of the scans are not great for two reasons. We did a quick scan just to include them with the presentation tonight. And also the pictures themselves are kind of deteriorated. You can see in the background that black is not just the back of what I was taking the picture on. It's actually that black construction papery type material that all scrapbooks from the 20th century seem to be made out of. And so it's not great for preserving long-term photographs. And so these are over 100 years old at this point. So there's some deterioration with it. So we're going to have to do a better job with scanning it and then manipulating it digitally so we can bring out some of these contrasts. And so what I'm going to do is show you, I think, 8 or 10 pictures from Professor Maxime's collection, along with the captions from that handwritten letter. And so this is really going to drive it home what life was like in Laurel and for the soldiers who were coming to train, especially in these early years. And so this says February 1918, the truck and load on the road to Belvoir. So that is Fort Belvoir. That is south of us here in Laurel. If you know where Mount Vernon is, George Washington's home, it's essentially down there, south of DC, going into Virginia. So you can see several soldiers, they got the truck. You can see a little bit of the topography that we showed you in the previous slide in the background as well. And so this is captioned as a last mess formation at Lower Camp Laurel, and we saw that on some of our newer acquisitions as well. They're designating, the lower camp from Camp Laurel, Camp Harrington, so there's kind of different acronyms or numbers going around in these early structure of what we know now as Fort Meade. And so you can see there's some tents on the left-hand side. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see a couple rows of soldiers in the middle of the road there, and some of the trees in the background. And then I love it because you get personal, even though we don't have any idea, who this soldier was that collected and wrote these captions for us. But thankfully, he did number the pictures and the captions, so we at least know for one page at least which pictures goes with which. So again, it's the last formation. Um, and we get some additional information about what the journey was to go from Laurel to Europe. And so they were catching the train, like Luis mentioned, getting on the B&O or the WB&A and going north. And then now we know this is going all the way to Hoboken. And so this, I think, is one of my favorite pictures because the scan's a little better, but you can see there's so much going on in the picture. So you can see that some of these wooden structures align with some of those images that we saw on the postcards that we recently received after the exhibit that we did. And you can see that, there's an officer on horseback, there's some of the soldiers. The caption is building a corduroy road, and I had to look that up. It's essentially a log or a plank road. So I guess there's, a lot of mud involved when you're trying to move, troops and accessories as well. But I like in the background, you can see the United States flag on the flagpole being flown high, and then the car, the old-timey car in the background as well. So I really like this picture because it kind of shows a whole array of what life was like from the soldier to the officers to all the different technology at the time. This is another clear picture, and again, this is on a trip to Washington from Camp Laurel, and so you can see that the trucks are loaded up. They're forming a nice tight caravan. You can see some details on the uniforms, and so this is if it's from Laurel to Washington, D.C. They're southbound. This would have been Route 1 at the time. 95 didn't exist, 295 didn't exist. So this would have been along Route 1, or maybe some other form of a side road coming from the base. But you can kind of see, even though the picture itself is cut out, you can still see buildings, signs in the background, and kind of in the far distance as well. So we're kind of leaving Laurel behind. This obviously is not Laurel, but I wanted to kind of show it to you for a couple reasons. These are the last remaining ones in the collection that have a caption directly associated with it. After we get to like 8 or 9, we don't have the second or third pages of the letter associated with the scrapbook, so we don't have that information. But I love that there's so much extra detail we now know. So we know the name of the ship is the George Washington at Pier 5 in Hoboken, and it's the 23rd U.S. Engineers, and we have the date, so we know how long it took them to leave the train. Was March 26th in Laurel. Took the train all the way to New Jersey, and it took them a couple days to get there. Probably, camped overnight in barracks, and then awaiting the ship that would take them to Europe. And so we have, I think, one or two other collection boat pictures in the collection of Professor Maxime. And so this is the Great Northern. That's another ship. You can see it's very packed ship transport or troop transport to Europe. And so they're leaving from France. And you can see the city in the background. There's supporting, a steel building. And then you can just see, soldier after soldier after soldier packed in there with their hats on board the Great Northern. And so this again is probably the most deteriorated out of this bunch that we're looking at now. But again, so we know that they did leave on the George Washington. There was also the Great Northern, so we know that at least the group that left Laurel was here on the George Washington. So you can kind of see some life on board ship, and then you can see it in the middle of the ocean from there. So this is really exciting for us to be able to explore this collection, and we thank the professor for allowing us to look at it, to have it in our hands, and to do additional research on it. So we're very excited about what this will help to tell us and what stories it'll help to tell us and what we can fill in from the narrative, because this exhibit was done for the 100th anniversary of World War I. So it was done in 2017, so fairly recently. But as you can see, the more information we get, the more stories we can tell, the more nuggets we can chase down in the archival records, and we can just start to telling a much more complete story. And so, again, if you have these things lying around or you see them out at auctions or antique stores or anything like that, take another look because you never know what you're going to find. And we would be honored and happy to receive anything that you would want to donate to us so we can help to tell a better story of what life was like in Laurel for World War I or World War II for this topic, but at any point in time as well. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna skip by that. I'm gonna go back to that, Louise. I hope you don't mind. Um, but I just kind of wanted to kind of gloss over. This is kind of another good visual, and then we'll go back to talking about what life was like in Laurel, but specifically on the home front in Laurel. And so these are some images of an even older exhibit that was done at the museum in 2004 called Over Here, Life in Laurel During World War II. So you can see that there was a lot of image of objects from our collection showcasing what life might have been like in Laurel. And so we kind of have the living room centered around the radio, the all-important communication at the time. You have the really powerful fan with just a brief cover on it. You have, the children's, the book, the lamps, the President Roosevelt at the time. And then there were different displays throughout the museum and in the basement level. And I'll throw this out there to our participants. If you have memories of this exhibit, we would love to hear about it. Or if you have memories or stories from your parents or grandparents or anyone in your family from life in Laurel during World War II, we would love to hear those stories as well. And so we had some uniforms and some civilian clothing from our pretty big textile collection actually that were on display as well. And then downstairs we did a kind of display of what life was like in World War II on the home product, focusing on all the domestic tasks and the war rationing, the bonds, and outside, I don't have a picture of it, so I apologize. But Dave Mann, one of our volunteers at the time, did a great job with some other volunteers doing a victory garden. So we talked what the importance was of having this huge domestic army back home as well, and how important that was for the army. And then I'm going to segue now to the maps because, again, I love maps. And then I'll pass it back over to Luis to transition us back to World War II and the rest of his presentation. So, again, I wanted to be consistent in terms of the maps we were looking at. And like I said, the USGS is a great tool for having that consistency and that comparison over time. And so I can go really far into this, but I won't tonight. But you can see that in less than 20 years' time. The previous map was 1926, which was the closest I could get to the war at the time. These maps were available from then until 1944. You can see in less than 20 years' time, we can see a huge change in Laurel. There is so many more black dots now in that upper left-hand corner. And then we can see the Laurel racetrack, which had been in existence, is now fully defined, and the actual track is there. Its support buildings, the stables are there. Our friends over in Bacontown, Mount Zion Church is actually represented and labeled, even though, again, it had been, the community had been in existence since 1860, the church since the 1890s, but it finally is being labeled on there. And then as we go to the right-hand side of your screen, we can see how much more that Fort Meade has been developed over time. And so now there's not only the different stations and the railroad that's serving it, but there's different markers, there's different training areas, and now we can actually see where there's, the base and the Army base boundary, and that there's some restricted areas. And so that now there is a better road going over to the base, but it's much more developed than it was even less than 20 years ago in the previous map that we saw. Um, so again, we did the World War II exhibit 20 years ago. Okay, that's kind of scary. In 2004. And so there's a lot more again that we're able to tell with new inputs, new research, and some of the stories that we're able to tell from those new materials. So Luis, I think this is where you pick it back up. If you need me to go back to that home front screen, I can do that now or at the end of the talk.
Yeah, if you can go back to the home front right now, that'd be good. So
Okay.
before I continue, I'll add a fun fact about the George Washington. It was a German ship when it started. It was a passenger ship run from Germany to New York. And at the onset of the war, the U.S. interned the ship in New York. And eventually, when the U.S. entered the war, they took it over and used it as troop transport. And even though it was German, it was still called the George Washington. So we go to the Laurel home front. Okay, so before we move on to World War II, I'll briefly talk about the home front and Laurel. I mentioned earlier that Laurel largely greeted the influx of soldiers with open arms, providing comfort and support for men who are far from home. They pitched into the war effort, raising funds through Liberty Loans, the United War Work Fund, and then many local chapters from different organizations popped up. We have the Red Cross, the Patriotic League of Honor, and these were often formed by women who focus on fundraising, knitting for soldiers, collecting supplies, and anything else that would boost soldiers' morale. They participated in a towel drive to aid French hospitals abroad. There's a story about them taking up placards to petition the city of Laurel for electricity and sewers, which was apparently successful. Um, so it's nice. And then eventually the American Legion Post 60 was created in 1919, which was, even though it was after the war, it was for World War One veterans as a mutual help organization. And so for before I move on to World War II, I'll just say the World War One we have a ton of information on, and I did my best to condense it. I know I moved a little fast, but we have a lot of stories of like the women who work. We have a lot of personal narratives. Same with soldiers. We have a lot of soldiers' individual stories. And of course, if anyone is interested in learning more about that, you can feel free to email and I will gladly help. There's way too much for me to condense into this sort of simple webinar format, but okay, we go to World War II. So Laurel and World War II. So our previous exhibit had a lot of information on Laurel's involvement. It's mostly about the home front during World War II. So I will touch more on that, although I will get into a little bit about the military side. So here I put together some important dates to show how citizens were affected by the war effort and how they aided in the war effort. A lot of it is serving in the military, but volunteering, rationing of food and materials, and just doing what they can. As you can see, sort of a little bit about everything. I'll give you a second to read it. I did see so the story of the wanting volunteers for the cupola of Laurel High School to help plane spotters. I thought a lot of stories about that. I thought it was fascinating. And what I found most interesting is seeing who ended up volunteering. A lot of couples, a lot of couples doing night watch together. So take that as you will. Okay, next slide. So here are some source information from the Laurel Leader in our collection for some of those dates. We have the USO building is set to open, and they held a formal dance for men in uniform for the opening reception. That's on the left. In the middle, we have the naming of air raid wardens for 12 different sectors that they split Laurel into. And then on the right is some rationing. So the article is an example of rationing. This one's specifically for meat. Men, women, and children over the age of 12 were allowed 2.5 pounds of meat per week. So imagine that. And then it's got a lot of more fun information about, changing your diet and sampling different meats. And so it's a little fun source information. I'll give you a little moment to look through it, and then we can move to the next slide whenever you're ready. So Fort Meade during World War II, as you can see, it's now called Fort Meade as opposed to Camp Meade. It served as a recruiting training post and a prisoner of war camp. So it was boot camp for soldiers. In that top picture over there, you can see them on an obstacle course. Um, it also eventually would serve as an internment camp for Japanese, German, and Italian soldiers, not soldiers, citizens in the U.S. So, side note, my master's thesis, like I said, was focused on German internment during the war. And I think it's a fascinating subject that many people don't know about because Japanese internment was the big one. It's far larger, more widespread. So the primary reason that people don't really know about or speak about German and Italian internment is because the U.S. couldn't do it to the same extent as they did with the Japanese, as German and Italians were in the U.S. for many more generations, numbering in the millions, and they were vital to the economy. So many worked in ports and shipbuilding, especially on the East Coast, and interning them would cripple the economy and the war effort. So internment for German and Italians was very specific. There was a whole process to it, but it's very fascinating. If anyone ever wants to learn more, feel free to reach out. I can talk about that. Okay, next slide. So African Americans, I'll talk a little bit about here. So African Americans first, and then women. I will touch on both World War One and World War Two, sort of condensed into these. During World War One, more than 11,000 African Americans from Maryland served primarily in non-combat roles. The Maryland National Guard had the first separate company, which was a military organization for Baltimore's African American community. This company was first organized in 1879 and would eventually serve in World War One as part of the 372nd Infantry, where they saw services in the trenches of Verdun and then the Meuse-Argonne offensive. During World War II, the 372nd Infantry also served, but they served as static defense points in New York City and along the eastern seaboard. In Laurel, we have the story of Joseph Watkins, who lived in the Grove, which was the African American community, and he served in the military police in England. And in an interview with him, he spoke about how others from the Grove also served alongside him in the military. And then we also have the story of Mrs. Bernice Brooks, who shared with us that she and other young women from the Grove worked at Fort Meade during the war and primarily inspecting soldiers' uniforms. So there's a photo of Joseph Watkins. You can go to the next slide. So women. Earlier, I mentioned that women helped in the railroads during World War One, but they also served in military positions during both wars. Though at the time they weren't considered to officially be part of the military. Instead, they were considered citizens who volunteered. World War One, the big one is they worked as telephone operators, known as Hello Girls. They received veteran status in 1977, and then the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the women accepted for emergency services from World War II. They received their veteran status in the 70s and 80s as part of several bills that were passed. Next slide. Okay. So, oh, no, previous, yeah. So during World War One, the most well-known positions for women is probably serving as the telephone operators under the Army Signal Corps, but they also served in the Army Nurse Corps. The telephone operators, also known as the Hello Girls, were trained in Camp Meade in a section that was known as Camp Franklin, but then it would eventually be subsumed into Camp Meade. We have a story about the story later published that 48 women handled the exchange in Baltimore in three shifts, and then many went to serve on the front lines in France. Next slide. So this is an image of Camp Franklin, which is the home of the Hello Girls. That's where they lived, and there was a building switchboard built for them there. And as I said, they also took the train up to Baltimore. Next slide. Some more images of the Hello Girls at Camp Meade and on the front lines in Europe. This image to the right is in France, not too far from the front lines where there was active German artillery. So, as I mentioned earlier, much of our previous exhibit talks about the citizens of Laurel helping on the home front, and this, of course, included women. Minutes from the Laurel Women's Club from the 1940s show how they participated in many wartime activities, such as hosting a victory garden contest, selling war bonds, working for the Red Cross, and serving as USO center hostesses. We also have the story of Wilma Foster and Lorraine Miller, who both ended up in Laurel after the war. Wilma went to high school in Virginia, and when she turned 18, she applied to Fairchild Aviation in Hagerstown, where she was trained to operate a rivet gun and a drill press. Lorraine was born in Fulton, but attended St. Mildred's High School, which is now St. Vincent Pallotti. She signed up to volunteer at the USO Club in Washington and was trained by the Girls Service Organization. Okay, next slide whenever you get a chance. So some other examples of women in Laurel during their part is that of the Army Wives of Laurel and also Gertrude Poe. The Army Wives met at the Laurel USO Club, where they made plans for a mending and sewing service, gift wrapping committee, and a soldier shopping service. They also planned to volunteer at the American Red Cross, the USO Club, and help with war bond work. Gertrude Poe was the editor of the Laurel Leader from 1940 to 1980, and she later mentioned how she saw the women of Laurel rise to the crisis of war by taking on more and more roles to help the war effort. So I also want to mention the women who served. The first local woman in the military on November 6th, 1942, Anna Voris, enlisted in the Women Accepted for Volunteer Service, which was a branch of the Naval Reserve for Women. Its Army counterpart, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, was approved in May of 1942 and also saw the enlistment of tens of thousands of women. Initially, these women, like I said, were not given veteran status, but that would rightfully be corrected in the 70s and 80s with a series of measures passed by Congress. Okay. So here's some more examples from the Laurel Leader about calling for women volunteers. The one on the left is again for observation at the cupola of the high school and other posts. With so many men leaving for war, women became vital part of the defense work. Okay. And I believe that's it.
I think that's the end. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to say my goal again was to give a basic overview of Laurel during the two major conflicts. I tried to touch on various topics that give you enough information to perhaps spike your curiosity, and hopefully I've done that. And if you want to know more, anything I touched on or perhaps that I didn't talk about that you're interested in, feel free to email me or us, and I'll gladly pass off any information that I know.
Okay. Well, great, Louise. This was fabulous. Thank you so much. And I know you did a lot of research, and I love that it dovetails so nicely with your own background and personal interests. So thank you for sharing that with us tonight as well. So yeah, I will open it up if there's any questions or anything. We don't have anything in the chat or the Q&A. So we have some time to put that in. So if you're curious about anything that Louise talked to you about or about kind of our behind the scenes museum process, or if if you have any just stories or remembrances of your family during World War One or two in Laurel or anywhere else. We'd love to hear it either tonight or at the museum. So I will let you think about that for a minute or two. I'm going to make quick announcements of some of our upcoming programs, and then we'll do a final look at the chats, and then we'll just kind of end our evening together. So I am going to switch my screen here. And then do a hard, hard right turn here into to talking about other exhibits that we have on display. So our current temporary exhibit from now until the end of the year is awkward family photos. And so these are some of the really fun traveling pictures that we have from awkward family photos. And we have Laurel edition as well. So a lot of people have been kind enough to submit pictures, so we have pictures of our own board members on display. We have some pictures of Laurel City Council members and city employees as well. And so it's a really fun guessing game. It's just a great way to come and just have a laugh and just kind of just relax and have some fun at a museum exhibit. So that'll be open now until December 22nd, which is the last day that we are open for the year. We have free admission. It's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 12 to 4. So you will likely see Luis there if you do come on the weekends. And we would love to have you there. It is a really fun time. If you are more into photography or the history of cameras, we have you covered there as well, because we have an educational component as well, showing collection items on cameras from 1897, I think is the oldest, all the way up to some past models of iPhones and Blackberries and things like that. So that's a lot of fun in an educational sense as well. If you want to come and hear this presentation again and see some of these items that we have in person that we were just able to share digitally tonight, then please come to the Maryland City at Russet Library next Tuesday night. This is part of their Veterans Day celebration, or in terms of November, and this was, part of the reason why we also wanted to do this presentation tonight. So if you want to see it again and see these items in person, please join Louise and I over at Russet next week, and spread the word to anyone who wasn't able to watch it in person tonight. Kind of going along with our awkward family photos, our fall or kind of winter Children's Day at the museum is going to be on December 1st. And it's just kind of a great way to kind of explore photography and kind of have fun with a very kind of technical aspect of cameras and photography. And we're just going to have a lot of fun with that. So that is free. Donations are accepted. You don't have to register, but we hope to see you there on December 1st. And then just real quick, we kind of have our uh, holiday open house and our hours toward the end of the year. So December 6th, 7th, and 8th, we have our kind of annual holiday open house. This is a time when we'll have some goodies out. We will have our brand new collective ornaments for sale, and we'll have some nice special sales in our gift shop as well. So that's a great way to get some local gifts for those people, especially history lovers in your families and friends, and to support the museum at the same time as well. And if you are a volunteer or thinking about volunteering, then please come to our happy hours. It's a great way to enjoy a little potluck, get to know the museum, and look at our family photos for one of the last open weekends. So that's on December 6th. If you are interested in that, please email us at info@laurelhistoricalsociety.org. And then finally, just a shameless plug to renew or join as a member of the organization, or to send a few dollars our way to support the presentation tonight and let us know about some of the topics that you are interested in for our webinar series. And that is it. So thank you so much. If you again have questions about this presentation, anything that Luis talked about, any of his special interests, please feel free to email us. info@laurelhistoricalsociety.org is the best way to get in contact with all of us. That is a museum building all the way at the end of Main Street, and we would love to see you at the museum. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass it back over to Luis and check in with our chat. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. If you are watching this on YouTube, then please like and share and subscribe and all the good stuff while you were there. So thank you so much.
Okay. So we did have two questions, both from Thomas Banfield. Maybe Anne, you can answer the first one, but I'm not entirely sure. But it's about the proximity fuses for the anti-aircraft shells during World War II by the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And he wants to know if that work was done in the current location or was it done in Baltimore? Do we know that?
No, that's a really great question and very specific. So I don't know the correct answer. I guess I would hypothesize that it was in the Laurel location because we did have on our previous exhibit, the one that just came down a couple months ago, it's all Laurel. We did have a section of that exhibit devoted to the Skaggsville area and the APL in kind of that area of Laurel. So we did actually have two of those proximity fuses on display, and we have one in our collection. So I'm happy to get in touch with you and talk about that for the information we have, and also to put you in touch with our contact over at the APL in their archives. So rather than take a wrong guess, my feeling is that it is at its current location, but they can definitely tell you in a little more detail than I can.
And the second question, which I can answer, was were the railroad troops at Fort Meade considered to be Army engineers or Transportation Corps troops? So I actually just looked this up before the presentation. And so the 128th Transportation Company was originally formed in April of 1918 as part of the 66th Engineers Services of Supply, and they were at Camp Laurel. The 66 was a standard gauge railway operating regiment, and they went to France out of the port of Hoboken.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much because I could not field that question. So thank you so much for answering that, Luis, and thank you, Thomas, for asking your great questions. So yeah, I think we will say good night. I'll stop the recording just a couple seconds here. We'll stay on for just a minute or two in case anyone has any additional questions. But yeah, Luis put the donation and membership information into the chats. Like I said at the beginning, this is the final session for our fall speaker series. So we don't have anything in December, but we will have the holiday open houses. So we do hope you come to the museum either for the open house or just to see the Awkward Family photo exhibit before it ends on December 22nd. So thank you everyone for your time tonight or whenever you're watching this. Thank you so much to Luis for all his great information and presentation. And we hope that we get to see you at another webinar or in Laurel. And in the meantime, have a great evening and be safe and be kind. And we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone, for your time tonight.
Thank you, everyone.